Welcome to our fourth and final session of the day for a discussion on moving beyond stabilization toward inclusivity. My name is Ruth Citrin. For those of you I don't know, I'm an associate fellow here at Chatham House, coming by way of the U.S. Department of State before my think tank career, working on Syria and Middle East issues. I'm joined on this panel by Lena Khatib, who of course you all know, who is the director of the Middle East and North Africa program here at Chatham House, the leader of the Syria from Within project here at Chatham House, and also a commentator and a writer on politics and security in the Middle East and North Africa more generally. Also by Salma Kahale, who is the founder, the executive director of Dawlati, a not-for-profit foundation that works with civil society, women, youth. I understand is working on a project on memory and oral histories, and also undertakes advocacy. And with Lena Sinjab, also a senior consulting fellow with Chatham House, and a BBC correspondent who's followed the Syria conflict, I think, from its earliest days, and has also served as regional editor for the Middle East with the BBC World Service. So the last panel in any day-long discussion like this has both challenges and opportunities. The challenge is often to find something fresh in the discussion, to really take us to break some new ground. The opportunity is that we can build on some of the discussion that's gone before us. And to that end, what I'd like to do is just recap some of the wave tops first. And after we do that, really ground us in where we are now. Because when we look at the title of this panel, Beyond Stabilization Toward Inclusivity, I think we might all agree that we're not actually beyond stabilization yet. We probably haven't even gotten to stabilization. So we have this interim period before we can get to that longer-term reconstruction thinking, where we need to position ourselves or think about the next year to 18 months. And that's where I think what we'd like to do with this last panel, both from a geopolitical perspective, from what's happening inside Syria, and the view of the civil society and Syrian civilians about what expectations should be and how we begin to move forward. But doing that wave top review so it can kind of guide us through this conversation. And I'm really hoping that we make it a conversation after some opening remarks by our guests. I think we began the day in an interesting place, looking at, and I think Emma described it as the irregular, illegal, dependent, and competitive economic relationships inside Syria, and sort of this competition among regional actors in the economic plane inside Syria. And then we continued to that it's a difficult discussion, the one about reconstruction, because as Steve as he points out, we're not really at a place to begin an effective and inclusive reconstruction. But Nader brought us back to an important point, which is you can't leave states in an unstable situation for years on end. We have learned that there are repercussions to this, and one of those that the international community, Europe and the United States, always have their eye on is this resurgent extremism, and what becomes a breeding ground when you leave a conflict unresolved as you wait for the conditions to be ripe for you to re-engage comprehensively. And I thought it was very compelling in that discussion that even there we got down to the concept of community-based interventions, what the international community could and should be doing at the local level, even if you don't really have the space to work in at the national level, and really evaluating whether there is space to do that, while bearing in mind, and I'm going to quote Steve again, another important point, which is what does the international community really want when it says meaningful transition at this point, given the realities that I'm going to ask Lena to talk about. And wait a minute, given one more complexity, and that is the last panel, which was the challenges to social cohesion, what is needed to begin to repair fractures, and how you create the conditions to get there. But all of that has to come back to where we are today. And if you wake up this morning or looked at the news yesterday, you see that the Russians were bombing in Idlib. This panel is asked to talk about the Astana arrangements versus the Geneva Process, and about what it takes to create stabilization in this country. And I'd like to ask Lena to open with a that reality check about what is happening on the ground.
Thank you very much, Ruth. I think it was a very informative day, full of really valuable intervention from different, esteemed colleagues, talking about the economy, the reconstruction, and the social cohesion in the Syrian society. But are we actually there yet with a regime that is still acting, if not the same, but worse than what they did in 2011? If we go back to the demands of the Syrian people and the discussions by the international community asking different brokers at the time to talk to the Syrian regime to release prisoners, we are exactly at the same stage here today. Apart from that, we are still having like millions displaced, hundreds of thousands killed, and still hundreds of thousands inside, inside prisons and detentions. The regime today, we've reflected that in a paper that I've co-authored with Lena that was launched here in October. We've reflected on the realities on the ground and how the regime is acting while making use of the presence of both, the Iranians and the Russians and the differences between them and taking, opportunities there. But, the reality on the ground, even for loyalists today, and that was mentioned or referred to by some colleagues earlier in the day, that there is no stability at all, even for the loyalists. Today, the situation inside Syria is defined by how much loyalists you are, not with if you are with or against the regime. For the regime, any opposition is out of their, of the map. They don't want the refugees to come back. They're not welcoming them. They don't want anyone who is a different color for the regime from the areas that they call as incubator for terrorism. They are not welcoming them. They're not including them in any processes. What you see inside Syria in government-controlled areas is that there is a winner and there is a loser. There is a ruler and there is the one who is ruled. There is the powerful and there is the powerless. You don't have a situation where the regime is in a winning situation and willing to discuss any concessions at all. What they're willing to do today is build on the success, as how they see it, success of winning the war against what they see as terrorists, which is the rest of the population that voted against them or called on the change of the regime, regardless if they held up arms or protested peacefully or did whatever just to oppose the regime. They are not counted in. I go regularly, not regularly, but I do some visits to Damascus. I was there just 2 months ago, and almost the discussion everywhere you go is how difficult the economic situation is, how people woke up after the end of the war to realize that the reasons why in 2011 the opposition revolted against Assad are still the same, if not worse. Loyalists are talking to the regime and saying, you have been depriving us from everything during the war, saying that it's because you're fighting terrorism. That battle is over. Why there is no electricity? Why there is no gas? Why there are no opportunities at work? Why there are no equal chances for everyone, not for a small percentage of the population that is favored by the regime to take all the opportunities, and widening the gap, extremely widening the gap between the poor and the rich, between the ones who were shabiha, if I can use the term, the ones who were fighting for the regime, peacefully, and the ones who kept quiet. Even keeping quiet is not enough today for the regime. There is only room for those who were very vocal in their support for the regime. There are lots of economic problems that the regime is facing today, even with the conflicting interest between Russia and Iran. They're cashing on their giving support to the Iranians by making the private sector that remained inside Syria to pay the debts and give deals to the Iranians on the extent of the private sector. Of course, not the regime-linked private sector like Samer Foz and the others. And situation is only getting dire. And I wanted to tap on the reconstruction or the social cohesion. How can you do that at a time where the regime is still not trusted, is still not transparent in all the deals? The corruption is multiplied by thousands of times in comparison to 2011. There is warlordism that is controlling everything there. at the extent of even the loyalists who are not taking all the chances, you know, the benefits are scaled from, you know, small benefits to high benefits, but of course not everyone is happy. And also at a time where, you know, social cohesion does not exist where there is no justice. The thousands or millions of displaced that are living in government-controlled areas have no voice, have no rights, have nothing but to keep their heads down out of fear, keep their heads down and beg for living and beg for their bread, not for any integrity, not for any dignity, not for any equal rights. That doesn't exist in today's Syria, in today's Assad Syria that claims to have won the war at the extent of providing peace and stability in Syria. And at that point, I think we talked a lot about, you know, the international community interfering and doing something for the Syrian society through the UN, through international organizations that can pressure the regime, but with the absence of international will to find a peaceful solution for Syria, that is completely out of the agenda. And I think at this point, I would probably hand over to Lina, who can talk more about this, that we have also mentioned extensively in our paper in November.
Thank you, Lina. That's a great opener. And I think as we're also thinking about the paper, by the way, is in your folders. It's the second of the two papers that were shared with you. There's two points I wonder, Lina, if you might address. First is how we would think about the nature of the Syrian state at present and how it has evolved over the course of the conflict. And that's one of the fundamental points that you bring out in the paper. The second one would be kind of this, the balance of external actors and their involvement in Syria and where it's leading us. Because, you know, today, as we look at the configuration in Syria, we still talk about a regime-held area, though its footprint has grown. We still talk about a Kurdish SDF-held area backed by a coalition with dwindling U.S. presence, and an opposition or an area sort of backed by the Turks. And that's been the frame with which we've understood this conflict or sort of understood the situation on the ground for some time. But if we have to think out a year or 2 years, should we continue to be thinking in those terms, or should we be thinking about what arrangements might arise if the ground shifts further?
Okay, thank you. Well, as you heard, the situation is a lot more complicated than many perhaps would like to present it to be. When it comes to the state of the Syrian state, if you look at the paper that we published, the title is Syria's Transactional State. And that's because looking at the state from the outside in might give the impression that the situation in Syria is business as usual when it comes to state institutions. That's definitely the narrative that the regime and its backers would like the world to kind of get, which is that ministries have remained, municipalities have remained, state institutions have remained, and therefore it's business as usual, and therefore the international community should just get on with it, should engage in reconstruction, should just engage with the Syrian state as if nothing happened, because the regime, by taking over most areas back, is just restoring things to the status quo that existed before 2011. So that's the regime narrative and the Russian narrative, and to a certain degree also the Iranian narrative. However, looking at the situation from the ground up reveals a very different story. Lina already spoke about the increasing gap between the haves and have-nots. It's not just a social issue and an economic issue, it's also at the level of state institutions. In many cases, despite their existence, when it comes to performing their roles, when it comes to delivering their services, looking at the situation from the ground up reveals a very different story. It's a story in which the Syrian state has been hollowed out. And instead, we have a proliferation of profiteers, not just economic, but also security profiteers, who are sometimes performing roles that the state typically would perform. And so in addition to the regime being held captive in many ways by its external patrons, Russia and Iran, the regime has also, because of lack of capacity in certain cases, lack of access in other cases, has had to engage with these profiteers on the ground. And therefore, these profiteers are also expecting something back from the regime. And therefore, what we're saying is the old model of looking at the Syrian state as your typical autocratic state is now has evolved into a situation in which the main feature of the way the state conducts itself is transactional. And this means that even institutions of security, like the army or the security services in Syria, are also not the kind of uniform institutions they used to be, and that's not because of defections. Even within these loyalist institutions that have survived, the situation on the ground has become very complicated, because very often you have the rise of what we here at Chatham House call hybrid actors, that are basically actors that are both state and non-state. And these hybrid actors are becoming more of a reality in Syria and will affect the situation in the year to come and beyond. And of course, I always say Syria is not Iraq, and different countries are very different, and Syria is not Lebanon. We have to bear that in mind. However, I think it's just useful to think about Lebanon and Iraq just as comparative cases when it comes to the long-term future of such hybrid actors and what might happen in the future. I'm not saying this is definitely going to happen in Syria because other variables might intervene. However, if you look at Hezbollah in Lebanon, if you look at the popular mobilization forces in Iraq, you'll see that these hybrid actors eventually got legitimacy and have become political actors as well, and have, in many cases, been both part of the state because they have been given this legitimacy, and in some cases, like the PMFs, it seems in Iraq that they're heading in the direction of being given their own ministry. So here we see the shape of the state changing in order to accommodate these new actors. In Lebanon, of course, Hezbollah is now the strongest political party in the country, but it's only strong because it has tried to eliminate oppositional forces. So there are many cautionary tales that one can think about when you take into consideration the trajectories of hybrid actors in Iraq and Lebanon. As you can see, Iraq and Lebanon are not identical. The trajectories of the hybrid actors is not the same, and Syria may well be something different. But what I'm saying is that the shape of the Syrian state is changing, and these changes might take us into a very complicated future when it comes to politics and security. When it comes to the external actors, I know I've spoken for a lot, but it's a very complicated situation. There are people who basically see the regime as very shrewd, as having played the Russians against the Iranians, who see in Assad's visit to Tehran, for example, a way for Assad to assert himself vis-à-vis the Russians by kind of displaying a closer relationship to Iran. The way I personally see it is Iran in particular, despite the economic contracts drawn up in Syria, despite its engagement with the private sector, ultimately Iran is hurting because of US sanctions and because of mounting pressure that is led by the US amongst other external actors. And so it is in Iran's interest to kind of show that it is influential in the region. And that to me explains Rouhani's visit to Iraq and also the summoning of Assad to Tehran. In that visit, Khamenei said to Assad, "Congratulations on your victory, which we see as part of Iran's victory." So to me, this is very much about Iranian posturing more than anything else. And to me, Iran engages in this posturing when it feels a bit squeezed. It wants to, on the one hand, justify to its domestic audience why it's doing what it's doing in Syria by saying, look how influential we are, and on the other hand, project an image of strength to the United States in particular. So here we see that Assad is also not, I'm not saying completely without agency, of course not, but I see Assad as being more of a smaller player in the triangle between Russia, Iran, and the Assad regime. I see the primary player here being Russia. Russia wants to be seen as the broker in this conflict. It wants everyone to recognize that there cannot be peace in Syria without engaging Russia. And I personally feel that, as ever, the elephant in the room in everything remains the issue of the political process and political transition, or a political settlement, however you want to put it, in Syria, which can only happen, in my view, if the United States decides to take a bold step and engage Russia bilaterally, and then engage the UN in the process in a meaningful way. Because until now, Russia has felt rather comfortable in Syria. It is not willing to compromise because it doesn't see the need to, and therefore it has never, in my view, taken the Geneva process seriously. But things are beginning to shift a bit internationally, which of course will have an impact on the ground in Syria. But I'll stop here.
Okay, I think what I'd like to do is we'll circle back to some of the questions of the geopolitical actors, what it means, I think, from your perspective for the U.S., what you would envision for U.S.-Russian engagement if that were to sort of break the stalemate, and then come back again to this concept of the other triangle between Turkey, Russia, and Iran, which are supposed to be the actors stabilizing Syria long enough to get us to a place where you might move forward. But I want to turn to Salma before we do that, to come back to the Syrian people, civil society, the actors, you know, the community most affected by this unresolved, festering conflict. And you had mentioned during the break that we really need to come back to those issues, the concepts of justice and some of the expectations of the Syrian people. And when they look at a conflict that looks like nowhere near resolved, and one that is increasingly dominated by, and I think Lena brought out an important point by hybrid actors who can legitimize themselves over time as the situation morphs. How do we create more space for Syrian civil society and local communities to get back to that discussion of empowerment, assistance, what you do in the interim?
Yeah, I mean, I'm on the pessimism panel here, but I'm going to try and bring a little bit of hope into it, because I think that being realistic about what's happening doesn't mean that we give in to what's happening, but we need to devise new strategies for resistance, and look at new ways in which we can actually talk about how do we fulfill the aspirations of the Syrian people? How can we get to a place where communities, different marginalized groups can achieve some semblance of justice, of dignity, of freedom, whether that's in the short term or the longer term? We need to devise new strategies, and that starts with admitting that, you know, we really need to look long term, and it's not about this inclusive peace process or a peace plan that's going to get us there, at least in the short term. I don't know if you know, how much we can build into it, but I think that we can't talk about social cohesion or, you know, all of these things without talking, as I was saying, about the issue of justice, and talking about justice in the broader sense, whether we're talking about you know, the need for truth-telling. And I think this is important in the day we haven't talked about the need and the space that needs to be created to actually talk about what happened and admit what happened. And in order for us to do any of the social cohesion, we need to create the space where we can speak about the pain, the violations, and to hear the victims. We need to talk about, we need to talk about accountability, but we also need to talk about social justice and having, and Zaki mentioned this, but also having, you know, talking about justice, you know, how do we deal with the needs of victims of the conflict. So if we're talking about detention, how do we deal with the needs of families of those who are missing and disappeared, whether it's everything from knowing what happened to psychosocial support to dealing with the legal issues that they face. And you know, I think we need to look at how do we I think what we need to do is, you know, we've talked about a little bit on transitional justice and inclusive peace building. And I think we need to kind of, again, as we talked about, is really look at more realistically, think smaller perhaps. And I like to say post-conflict mechanisms, because we don't have a transition and we don't have justice. So what are the spaces, what are the mechanisms, what are the opportunities that we may have in post-conflict in order to be able to address the needs of different communities? So for instance, we had one of these mechanisms was the regime's attempt to close the detention file by providing death notices for those who were killed in detention. And in its attempt to say, well, you know, now you know the fate, goodbye. And I think families have, you know, and what civil society has done and victims groups have done is say, actually, no, what we need to know is where our loved ones are buried. We need to be able to give them proper burial. I want to mourn my children. I want to know how they really died. I want to be able to bring the perpetrators to justice. And so taking those different post-conflict I don't know if they're opportunities, but there are mechanisms that are being done by the regime and by others, and try to insert within them the needs and demands of those communities, and try to get real, real justice in some way.
Thank you, Selma.
Can I just
please
add a note on what Selma is saying? I think, you know, coming from the pessimistic, point of view, I think there are still some points that we really need to build on, and this is the civil society, especially in diaspora, that can do at this time, where you need to continue with the lobbying in the international community, lobbying to push the Americans, to push the European Union and the UN to pressure the Russians or the Iranians to deliver something. And the example you gave on the death notes is an example of the pressure as well. Yes, the results were not great for the families who've lost their loved ones by just receiving this death note, but the regime responded to pressure from the Russians to do something on the detainees file and deliver just a little bit of information. So, you know, keeping up the pressure, keeping up the lobbying is a way to reach, you know, minimum changes or achievements in the direction of the civil society, or what the Syrians need for a just future.
I think that's actually, I'm glad you followed up with that, because it brings me back to where, Selma, your comments were leading to me, and we'll come back to the geopolitics in a second, but I want to bring us back to something in our panel 2, I believe, when our panelists were asked to do policy recommendations. I think it was Nader who mentioned we need to be able to identify, both I think Steve and Nader mentioned the need to identify some of the asks. What is it we would expect of the regime, and what is it we would expect external actors to press for from the regime, even as your first steps, if you have to have an incremental moves toward, and it may not be peace, it may not be resolution, it may not be reconciliation, but at least toward that path of you are beginning to acknowledge that the regime might be hitting some of the markers that the international community expects of them. And I put to you, as panelists, what do you think those might be? Would it be the persistence of arrests and detention in areas where the regime takes over? Would it be something related to how detainees who've been held are treated? Would it be other access issues into areas under regime control? Do we have, as a panel, some thoughts on what would be initial measures we would ask for?
I think in working with families of detainees and former prisoners, it has been really striking how practical they can be about these issues and putting actual practical, measurable steps. So in some of the demands that the families, in Families for Freedom and others that we've been working with are, one, we want to know. We want to know where they are. As a first step, we want to know who has died, where they are, who is still alive, and and their fates. And we want access to detention centers, for instance. How can we have ICRC visit all detention centers, not just jails? So they have been. We want to have access to justice. So if you arrest them, don't take them to arbitrary courts. But how do you get access to proper justice? I think they are able, and of course, wanting freedom and justice and accountability, but they have been able to put some real markers for for instance, how to deal with the detention file. And I think this is something that, in how we deal with putting these kinds of trust-building measures or these markers, we really need to go back. We can go back and talk to those people affected, and they can very clearly put some practical steps that can help then be taken up by the international community, by the UN, for pressure.
If I may add, Ruth, on that, is also, I've been to Douma recently, and that most of the population were displaced. They were pushed out to Idlib, but some decided to stay there. Just like in Daraa, some people of the local community stayed there, and there were deal in the south, but and not similar to Douma, but there were some sort of a deal in Douma to stay. When I entered there, the destruction is massive, but still you can find few families, building up a window, trying to clear the rubble from some areas. It's completely neglected by the government. There's no services, nothing at all. But one thing I've seen the Russian patrol there in Douma, where people trust the Russians more than they trust the government. At the entrance to Douma, there is a checkpoint by the regime, but inside there's only the Doumans, the people of Douma, and the Russians. And people are minding their own business. And they are able to speak freely against the regime, because there are no regime representative inside Douma. And they're trying with the little means that they have to rebuild their own, where there is a chance to rebuild. You can find children going back to schools, people on strollers selling fruits and vegetables. So the means are very limited, but people want to stay and want to do something if the regime is not present, if there is a lesser evil enemy, if they call it, like the Russians, are there, where it guarantees their safety, their dignity, and prevention from detention. And we've seen that Douma, during the evacuation, the detention was less than in comparison to other areas, and also Ta'fish, robbing all their properties, was not there because the Russians were controlling the situation. So it is sad to say that for the opposition, they see the Russians as occupying forces, but these occupying forces is much better for them than the regime forces. So that goes back to what you were talking, is that if you just keep on the pressure on the Russians and come up with minimum demands for at least the local community to sustain and continue their lives, there are means of maneuvers with them.
Thank you both, actually, and that brings us back to that. It's that geopolitical question, because it really raises the issue, the question of what to expect from the Russians. And so I would take it in two ways, Lena. One, again, when we look at the who holds what territory in the country, and the negotiations between the Turks, the Russians, about how to manage those areas that are sort of under Turkish control, and what is our expectation? Are the Russians sort of biding their time alongside the regime, kind of waiting to push back little by little against Idlib? Or can the Russians be viewed as a source of potential stability, a buffer in areas where the regime is taken over. If you can keep a weak but still predatory state away from the Syrian community.
Yeah. First of all, just a word of caution, because of course now Russia wants to present itself as the better kind of external patron. We have to remember that Russia's way of conducting itself in war is based on regarding civilian deaths as an inevitable aspect of war. And this goes all the way back to the way the Russian military is trained. The Soviet military was trained in the same way, which is to say, look at World War II and how many people we lost in that war, and therefore any engagement by us in any conflict will inevitably result in the death of civilians as collateral damage. So there is no remorse whatsoever on part of Russia for all the civilians who have died as a result of its intervention in Syria. So if anyone's thinking that the reason why Russia has not attacked Idlib yet is because it is worried about the big humanitarian catastrophe, that's not the reason. It is worried about the humanitarian catastrophe only because this would reflect negatively on its image, but not because Russia really cares. So that's one thing. And the reason why, if you ask both regime loyalists and the opposition today, would you rather basically have a deal with the Russians or the Iranians, the reason why they would probably go for the Russians rather than the Iranians is simply because of lack of choice, not because they necessarily like the Russians. So what Russia wants in Syria ultimately has nothing to do with Syria. Russia entered this conflict from the very beginning in order to reassert itself on the international stage. And I always go back to this. I've been saying this for many years now, and I'm sorry if you've heard it before from me. But ultimately, this entry point for Russia came because of Western inaction. Came because there was no willpower, mainly in the United States, to drive this conflict towards a resolution, and Russia found basically an opportunity and took it. And that's why Russia has not really taken Geneva very seriously and still doesn't. So when it comes to what Russia wants in Syria, now that it's there, it wants to shape Syrian institutions so that they are relatively strong and viable, but also loyal to it. And this is where the end point for Russia differs from the end point for Iran, because the end point for Iran is similar to the model that we've seen in a place like Lebanon, for example, or even Iraq, in which you have both an infiltration of state institutions by Iran. As I mentioned earlier, the hybrid actors, they all happen to be supported by Iran in one way or another in these countries. And second, to create parallel structures to the state that would justify why these hybrid actors have weapons or have their own institutions, like sometimes charities, between quotation marks, that sometimes perform the role of the state in terms of service provision, etc. So that's what Iran wants. This model is not ultimately in Russia's own interests. And therefore, despite the partnership that we see between Russia and Iran today, ultimately, their vision for Syria is not identical for the future. And what Russia is also keeping an eye on is the spread of Iranian influence inside Syria. And that's another reason why Russia did not rush to attack Idlib. It's because in any major attack, it knows that it has to rely on the ground on Iran-backed forces. And that would have meant a spread of Iran-backed forces into Idlib, and it's not in Russia's interest. What Russia's doing instead is, as Lina said, try to man different areas that the regime and Russia have taken back with Russia's own military police, and that's partly to keep the Iranians out. It's not just to appeal to the local population, but also to keep the Iranian-backed forces out. However, when it comes to the local population, my understanding is that even regime loyalists are a bit nervous about Iranian presence in Syria because Iran is also working on having long-term influence in the country in a way that is seen as perhaps culturally alien, if we can put it this way, by many in Syria. So it's not just about the Sunni community kind of being nervous. It's even the Alawi community and others who are nervous about Iranian influence kind of at the societal level in Syria, which would change the character of Syria. So when it comes to the external actors, I go back to the issue of what Russia wants is international recognition. And that's why if the US were to engage in bilateral talks with Russia, I think this, for me, is the entry point to then bringing everybody else around the table for talks. Again, Russia cannot deliver the Assad regime. It cannot just tell the regime to do what it wants. There's a lot of pushback by the regime. It has happened. One of the concerns of Russia is if the regime just decides to, for example, launch an attack on Idlib anyway, because then Russia will be obliged to kind of support the regime in this kind of measure. However, I think if this high-level political process were to start, the regime is already feeling a lot less confident than it was before. I think the sanctions are working. And one thing we have to bear in mind is that Russia is also feeling this, because Russia does not want to pay for reconstruction in Syria. Russia, as the broker, wants to benefit from the conflict in Syria. And Russia wants the Gulf to pay and the West to pay, and that's why I go back to the narrative of business as usual, because it's saying, look, come on, just pay, that's it, the regime won the war, let's just move on. So there is also a leverage point when it comes to reconstruction money. It is a leverage point. And the sanctions are also another tool that I think is very useful that should be sustained. So Russia is ultimately not as comfortable as it pretends to be, just like Iran, as I said, is not as comfortable as it pretends to be. And Iran, just to close when it comes to the international side of the story, Iran for me is another entry point. Because, as I was saying earlier, the local population in Syria is not so happy about Iran. Russia ultimately is worried about Iran long term. The Saudis don't like Iran. Israel doesn't like Iran. The United States now wants to put a lot of pressure on Iran. So I think, in many ways, if I were an international somehow diplomat, I would bring everyone around the table to talk about Iran as one of the other entry points into trying to have a political conversation about the conflict.
Before I let us leave aside the international component, I might, Alina, come back to that, the point that you raised about the expectations regarding and what the U.S. could do, sort of. And so my question would be, and it's Lina, Salma, in the current context where the current administration has indicated that it really wants to take that force presence down to almost nothing, because it views the ISIS fight as nearly complete. With the indications that the stabilization assistance from the United States needs to be carried or burden shared to a much greater extent by the international community. That sends signals in terms of the intent of the current U.S. administration. If your prescription is that the United States needs to sort of reassert itself as a key actor and sit down first and foremost with Moscow and Russia on this issue, what would be the ask? I could hear you on the levers, sanctions, reconstruction, but what really would we be looking for at this point?
Well, Russia has always said that they're not tied to Assad himself being in power, that they're happy to follow the will of the people. I would hold Russia accountable for these kinds of statements. Right now, we have a constitutional committee that is being formed by the UN. And I think the reason why this process is delayed, etc., is because neither Russia nor the Assad regime are taking it seriously. So this would be one of the asks from Russia. It would be, okay, here we have a UN resolution that is ready, and you're saying you are happy with political transition if that's what the Syrian people want. So how about we take this seriously and start that as a measure? Because one of the key things for Russia is to basically show that the Geneva process is useless and meaningless and completely pointless, and that's why it has set up the Astana process as a parallel path. And I would say to the UN that they shouldn't just say, oh, we're not going to concern ourselves with Astana, let's just focus on Geneva. I think, yes, focus on Geneva, but also we need to make Astana pointless and useless. And that can only happen if the US engages in this kind of debate. So the formula is there. The ask is already there, and the plan forward is there. It was brokered by the UN. It's just that, unfortunately, I don't see the UN as being the actor that will be able to force Russia's hand. I think Russia needs, in a way, this kind of indirect legitimacy that will only come with US bilateral talks.
Just to follow up on what Lina says, I mean, if we look at the start of the Geneva process, whether Geneva 1, Geneva 2, and the resolutions, the final resolutions that came to formulate a political process, a transitional process for Syria, it was at a certain stage supported by the Russians, but only when the US administration changed and we have a new administration that pulled out of the Syria portfolio, that we found the Russians backing off the UN plan, the UN resolutions, and starting with the Astana or Sochi or hundreds of other plans that only the Russians are supporting and creating and making them look like successful. So I think the key issue, it's not only the European pressuring the Russians and put some leverage on support or sanctions to have a political change or political transition in Syria, but also for the US to come back and say, let's act as international community and prevail, basic human rights inside Syria. Okay, no one is talking about Assad leaving now. That's out of the question at the moment. But there are many other needs on paper that were endorsed by the EU and endorsed by the international community, and they are far away from any accomplishment. So this is somewhere where you can start as well with the Russians.
And before we open the floor to questions, one last question to Salma, perhaps. The themes that we're hearing in terms of the need to get back to a Geneva process and sort of the limits of the Astana process and the involvement of external actors and the tug of war, this, both a stalemate and creeping advances by the regime, but a continued tug of war and conflict on the ground. It leaves the Syrian civilians, the people who you engage with on a regular basis, including through this oral history and memory work. It leaves them in a quandary without a vision for both inside the country and out, without a vision for what the resolution will look like. So it kind of raises a question. If we're still in a state where the country has areas of competing authority, what are the expectations sort of at the community, local, civil society level, and what are the coping mechanisms in this interim period until we can sort of break open the process?
Wow. I mean, it's hard to talk about expectations, I think, because over the years, people have felt so let down. So I think some of the expectations maybe are, we hope that if the regime is going to take over Idlib, that it does it with the least amount of bloodshed possible. That's some of the expectation. I mean, this is some of the, our hopes have been reduced to such levels. The expectations, are, I mean, I think people, it's difficult to talk in a broader sense about the expectations of Syrians at this point, but because there's so many different, there's so many different experiences that Syrians have gone through, and the situation is so fragmented. But I think that, you have from the very basic, need to survive at this point and just have the minimal level of bloodshed. I think it's a cycle where people then come back and say, okay, you know what, actually, we need more than just this. And we see that. I mean, I remember when we had when was it that we had that ceasefire? And I think in 2015. And people, you know, okay, you had the ceasefire, and then people went out and started protesting again. And so I think it goes in cycles where we have what is it that we, you know, what can we expect? What is it that we have? Where are the opportunities? Can we say something? What can we ask for? And I think, you know, for us as Syrian civil society, in order to support Syrians and be part of this supporting their expectations, it's really at this point, given the situation and you know, the lack of certainty and the changes, it's about day-to-day work with communities and small-scale work with communities, and trying to find, you know, where are the opportunities here or there, small opportunities, and then, you know, learning from them, and then seeing how to build on them. And I don't think we can look at broad visions and strategies at this point. I think we are, you know, what we need to do is try to understand the new, you know, the new reality on the ground, and try to understand where our opening points are.
And let's just put one finer point on it and really be very pointed in the question. I think there's this assumption that amid a lack of resolution, and Lina Khatib noted earlier, you know, the regime portrays itself as gaining the ground and reestablishing itself. So the assumption might be, sitting outside the country, that, and you mentioned it earlier, people say, well, my hopes might be very limited at this point. If you're going to take more ground, please do it with the minimum loss of life. Please do it with a minimal repressive hand once you're in power. Are we at a point in which those that you engage with, and this could be answered by any one of you, among Syrian citizens and civil society, say that would be enough for me at this point? I can tolerate it if I can have quiet, if I can have return to some sort of normalcy in life?
I don't think it's enough, and I don't think they think it's enough. But I think that's a starting first, and I said it's different in different areas at this point, but I think it's a starting point from which we go to, okay, where do we, you know, what else can we get? Where are the opportunities? But it's not going to be enough.
Okay. So we've got about 35 minutes for questions. We'll open the floor. I'm going to go in the order in which I saw the first three, and I think that we need the mic here in sort of the third row. Then we'll go to the back and then the front.
Samar Jabour from the American University of Beirut. Taking what we have discussed, not just in this panel, but also throughout the day, to think about the different scenarios, but taking it down to the micro level. For example, the issue, the structures that have emerged in both Northwest as well as the Northeast. Local councils, governance structures, health services, other service delivery, and all of that. Is it, in light of the experience of Douma, Eastern Ghouta, as well as Daraa, is it too naive to say establishing facts on the ground, the facts that have emerged on the ground in those areas, they'll just be blown away as the conflict progresses and possibly the regime retakes over if it decides to launch? Or can we think about those local structures, local facts on the ground as being perhaps a nucleus for a glimmer of hope, a possible resistance structures in the future?
Wait, well, we're going to take a couple.
No, okay.
And then we'll...
William Pady, control risk, former British diplomat. I'm quite attracted by Lina Khatib's way in for the West to negotiate, because having sat through today and accepting the assumption that what you don't want is an Iranian dominated weak state with hybrid actors. And the Russian interest may be the one we can engage with and get to the point which we probably should have accepted 5 years ago that Assad wasn't going to go. How do you get into a negotiation, use the promise of reconstruction aid, which the Russians don't have, and which is what the West and the Gulf have to offer to prevent this failed state from continuing and getting worse? How do you use that in a way that doesn't completely blow out the water what Stephen Heidemann was talking about, that reconstruction having to be inclusive and effective, and not reinforcing the worst aspects of the Assad regime in the way? So how do you, what could you expect to happen that wouldn't reward the loyalists, allow the regime to continue to differentiate between the, and allow people to return who may be prepared to be quiet but not loyal? I'm just trying to look at this, what's in it for the Russians and Assad, if you like. What we want is to open up Syrian society again, reconstruct it, set it on a different path. How do you, what's your, as a former diplomat, I'm asking, what's your next move? What should I, as the British Foreign Secretary, be thinking about? I'm not the British Foreign Secretary, by the way.
If I can hold to the next round? If I can ask the third question, just hold to the next round, because these are two very different questions, and let's just give them their due time. Do one of you want to take the first question on kind of how should we be thinking about structures that sprang up? I mean, how does one sustain them and enable them to be empowering in the face of the advance of the state?
I mean, others may have other experiences, but my understanding of those structures that were created is that they haven't been able to be maintained as the regime has taken over these areas. I think they are important for their own sake, for not because they're sustainable afterwards, but because they give people those experiences which they take with them wherever they go, whether that's whether they are those people who were elected or so on, or whether you were people who participated in elections at some point, and take that with you as something that you may want to replicate and you can try to push for down the line. But the targeting of those people who are involved in local governance, their inability to stay in those areas for the most part has meant that they aren't, that we can't keep, they're not going to stay. I think it's important that where we do still have them, that they are supported, because, but we cannot, but they're not going to be established as facts on the ground, as you say. But, there are opportunities. I think it's, in some ways, there's, we need to look at how civil society, how communities can reorganize themselves to differently in their new settings, whether, or in the same areas, but with different, different congregations. It has to be reassembled in some way, probably with different actors, who haven't been known or targeted in the same way. So I think, yeah.
I might ask you actually a sort of a question on that, and based on some discussion that I personally had with those that sort of assistance implementers. And sometimes they talk about when you move into a space where you are not doing traditional, you can't operate in traditional stabilization assistance fashion, because you can't, stabilization assistance in practice is supposed to help reinforce the governance and the governing authority. But what do you do in a place like Syria where you're bringing in assistance, but you can't sometimes work? It's not about reinforcing the governing institutions. It's really supposed to come from the ground up and create sustainable mechanisms for enabling people's lives. And they've sometimes made this difference between assistance that is investments in tangibles and investments in intangibles. If you invest in a tangible, you will, or you bring an essential service, and you can sometimes replace a water pump or clear some rubble or rebuild a school, there is a risk. when the authority takes over or comes back in, they can put their placard on top of that water pump or on top of that school and reclaim it in the authority's name. But if you sometimes invest in an intangible, and that could be a community organization, media, elements of education, those are long-lasting. And I think, Dr. Jabour, when you're talking in some cases about some of those structures that spring up, some of the ways that organizing, we might be talking about lasting intangibles that actually survive the evolution of the conflict over time and resurface in different ways.
Yes, I mean, those experiences that people have in actually running local councils, in participating in local elections will stay with them, will go where they go. But they won't stay as, in the same way, in the same structures. I thought when you were saying investing in the tangibles that you were going to talk about the futility under bombing of actually, of investing in those tangibles as important as they are. But if the water pump stays and the community can use it, then anyway.
Okay, so then we have the second question, which was William's question on how you begin to move a process forward, taking advantage of some of those levers without then legitimizing the regime.
Yeah, well, the first step is to appoint me as Foreign Secretary. Thank you. No. Well, actually, that's as usual, William. You always ask the best and most complicated questions. Well, I think when it comes to what should happen, a key recognition is that what Russia craves when it comes to reconstruction, etc., is primarily not economic issues, it's also legitimacy. Knowing that, I would say the US should engage Russia bilaterally. That alone is the start of saying to Russia, we regard your existence as kind of, having a degree of very reluctant legitimacy. So that alone, I think, would be attractive to the Russians. The second thing we have to think about is that the changes in institutions that I spoke about that Russia is conducting in Syria is ultimately about having influence regardless of Assad. And that is something to bear in mind, that this way Russia can assure and ensure that it will be able to be influential in Syria regardless. The third thing we have to bear in mind is that this current regime is not ever going to reform. I am very uncomfortable with notions that maybe we can get the regime to behave a bit better. I think the answer has been very clear over the past 8 years of this conflict. This is not a regime that is one day going to somehow become a bit democratic. It's not. What the regime is very good at doing is play games. I talked about the narrative, but there are also very concrete practices that the regime is doing on the ground in order to show the international community that it is doing the things that the international community is asking for. And these kinds of games are only basically meant to bring in this reconstruction money and bring back legitimacy to the regime. So the regime itself will not reform, and Russia knows that. And I think ultimately, Russia knows that having influence in Syria can take many forms. It's not about this regime of Bashar al-Assad. There are, I always say, there's still people on the ground in Syria who are pragmatic and are, happy to engage. And I would say the approach, therefore, should not be about telling Russia, okay, now you're kind of given legitimacy, now you need to get rid of Assad. I would approach it from the bottom up. I would remove the regime pillars from underneath Assad one by one. That's what I would do. And there are already, ways in which this is already happening. As I said, the reliance on Russia for security provision, for example, is one way in which we can see that despite the bombastic image that Assad projects, he is not on solid ground in the degree that he would like the world to believe. So if you work on the ground when it comes to working with civil society, when it comes to working with the private sector, if you involve them in a process and they see that they have political backing, I think you can see traction. The problem in the past was that the UN process said that we're going to engage civil society, brought on board civil society, for example. But a lot of these actors, regardless of whether they were actually representative or not, although that was also an issue. But even if you broaden the scope and bring lots of people from inside Syria, these people will be vulnerable and ineffective for as long as there's no big, large-scale political process going on that provides them with political backing. Because otherwise, all you're doing is make these people more exposed and vulnerable. And if anything, which we've seen sadly with the UN process, increased divisions and competition between the groups. So this political process, as long as it happens at that high level, then you can involve these voices, and there's no lack of people on the ground who would be willing to act pragmatically. And I think this is how you eventually achieve political transition, not by starting with saying, let's get rid of Assad. And this is how you also prevent what you talked about, which is reconstruction money basically going into the wrong direction and ultimately ending up supporting the regime. So it's very complicated, but I don't think it's impossible. What's really lacking is political will to make it happen. Sadly, I don't think the UK is going to be able to. So even if I become foreign secretary, sadly, I'm not going to be the actor who can kickstart this process. I go back to Washington.
Any other comments before we go to the next? Okay. We have, I think, another 2 questions, one in the front here.
Hi, Kelly Strom. Lena actually just anticipated.
Your affiliation?
I edit Syria Notes, a small journal. Lena just anticipated my question because I was hearing you talking about what the US can do and heard earlier panels say about what the EU can do. And even though we're in London, this is the first mention I think I've heard of what the UK can't do. We've seen UK policy in retreat since mid-2016. And we've seen the UK's lead minister on Syria in the last couple of years emphasizing to MPs that the UK has no leverage, at the same time as the UK in private meetings in Turkey and with the US tries to exert some leverage. And despite the fact that the UK is the second most senior partner in the coalition. So I have my own list of what I think the UK can do but isn't doing, but I'd be interested in hearing some of your thoughts on what the UK can do but isn't doing.
And there was a second question here.
Nicholas Haslam, Adam Smith International. I spent several years supporting the subnational governments, institutions in the northwest and the south in Damascus that we were just talking about. I'd like to pick up on the professor's question. What do you expect for you talked about the hollowing out of the Syrian state. What do you expect for the Syrian state in the northwest and the northeast? The Assad regime is fundamentally against decentralization, but as and when these areas are reintegrated into the state, it may not have the authority to fully be effective.
We'll take those 2 and then do another round.
Right. Sorry, guys, 2 questions to me. When it comes to what the UK can do, I don't think the UK, as I said, can be the power that will bring all the actors together, but it can certainly lobby. And I know that the UK has played an instrumental role in getting the US to become ambiguous about the withdrawal from the Northeast. Basically, when it comes to the timeline, the numbers, at least the UK, I think, managed to achieve, a small but significant result in that regard. So I think the lobbying role is very important for the UK. Of course, there are smaller things that the UK can do, but personally, I'm thinking big picture. But one of the small things, but actually not too small, that the UK can do in the meantime, which is not about the political process, is something that is to do with the UN, which is that, and I only, to be very honest, recently found out about this, that the UN does not in Syria have basically an access monitoring mechanism for the delivery of aid by international NGOs, etc., when it has this kind of mechanism in other conflict settings. Why not? Can the UK take up this issue as a cause. It is, I think, rather achievable. So there are smaller things, that are also significant that the UK can do. But politically speaking, I think definitely I would just lobby Washington, and I would, engage in that regard. The question about the Northwest and the Northeast and decentralization. The regime is really not interested, I think, in decentralization. And decentralization, as me and my colleagues often say, is not the magical solution to everything. When it comes to the governance structures that we're seeing in the Northeast and the Northwest, I would be very cautious about expecting them to last. Were the regime to just take over these areas like it did in other places in Syria, I don't think the regime, despite its public promises to the Kurds, is going to tolerate Kurdish autonomy in the Northeast. I don't think that the regime will want anything but to go back to a centralized state model. And I would apply the same formula to the Northwest. So as long as we're talking about regime taking back things, I don't think federalism and decentralization are going to be viable.
Perhaps before we proceed to the next point on that, maybe a challenge. If we go back to the idea of the transactional state, the one that actually has been weakened over the course of this conflict and has some vulnerabilities and difficulties in extending its control, how does it then effect or oppose sort of a measure of Kurdish autonomy or continued control in far-flung parts of the country?
I would say this is different from decentralization in a formal way. I think some deals might be struck up with the Kurds, but I think the deal struck up will not go as far as Kurdish demands. And that's one thing to bear in mind. Ultimately, the regime has the upper hand here. The Kurds, if the regime were to, we're assuming the regime has taken over the Northeast. This means that the US role is reduced. Who's going to be the external backer for the Kurds? What agency will the Kurds then have vis-a-vis the regime? And we've seen, as we were talking earlier, in the areas taken back by the regime, that the way the regime is ruling is through these proxies, hybrid actors, etc. I wouldn't be too surprised if these same proxies pop up in the Northeast. And already Iran is popping up in the Northeast, and it is trying to court some of the tribes in the area, for example, with limited success. However, it is trying. So it's not the case that the regime will not find anyone and will have to engage with the Kurds and give them concessions. Yeah.
Okay, our next questions, we have one here in the front.
Thank you very much. Amr Mohammed, a Syrian researcher. Lina, recently there has been a report or some news saying that a military delegation from the Egyptian Army, United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia visited the Syrian Democratic Forces held city of Manbij. In the light of the regional rivalry between Turkey on one hand and these states, is it realistic to believe that there's going to be a scenario when this state is going to play a major role in the short period to come? And also, I would like to seize the opportunity to ask about your take on the future of ISIS in the region and the new insurgency model is going to be adopted by the group. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My name is Hyde, Chatham House. My question is mainly directed to Salma. And we were talking usually about transitional justice and our basically optimistic version of that thing. At least personally, I always talk about that. But if you look at what's happening now inside Syria, the regime is already implementing its own version of that. And one for example, the clear mechanism that has been used maybe on a smaller scale so far is that they are basically encouraging people to file personal charges against some of the regime opponents, whether former rebel leaders or other actors. So how do you see that basically playing out, and whether Russia or others can basically play a role in preventing the regime from implementing its own version through legal means, let's put it this way. And the other question is directed at Lina. Sinjab, which is mainly related to Russia's role. I mentioned that earlier, and you mentioned what Russia is trying to do in specific areas. But according to what I know, their basically role is quite limited to preventing regime security / military forces from entering those areas. But they are not doing much more, like basically when it comes to, so if people leave and they're arrested, they cannot do much. And they say it's not our priority. In those areas, especially teachers, have been dismissed by the government because they didn't show up during the conflict. So can Russia play a role in basically allowing those people to get their jobs back, for example, or basically play a bigger role without any sort of changes on the construction / political process?
Okay, since that was actually 2 questions, we're going to take these and then do one more round. So I know I have at least one other, but we'll have one more chance. I think the first, Lena, might have been to you? Yeah.
Yeah, stop asking me questions. I have 2 fantastic panelists who are much more interesting, and they're Syrian, and I'm not, so. Yeah, not you. How you? You did the right thing. Otherwise, otherwise I'd fire him, right? No. No, I must say, this is the first conference we have in which so many of us from the project have appeared on stage. Normally, to be very honest, we try to give a platform to other people, but we felt this is the third, and it'll be nice for us to show our faces in case people think there's a conspiracy going on behind closed doors. So here you have Lena, Hayed, myself, Ala, and Zeki, all being on stage. So there you go. Okay, so the question about the Saudi, etc., Emirati visit to the SDF. My understanding is that these visits did not result in much. They were motivated by concern about Iran because, as I said, Iran is trying to talk to some tribes, etc., but nothing much has come out of these discussions. There were talks about deploying troops and things like that. Nothing has been implemented. So the people there feel a bit kind of abandoned and concerned and played, and they're just turning to whoever is giving them a promise, and that explains, how the situation can appear a bit different from the reality. But sadly, it didn't lead to anything much. When it comes to ISIS, it's actually interesting, and I'm happy that we designed this conference in a way in which ISIS is practically, actually, literally not on the agenda, and that's deliberate. We felt we should think about the future of Syria and inclusiveness. Although I'm talking a lot about the external actors, but that's why we have Salma and we have Lena to bring us back to the ground. Because a lot of the debate on Syria tends to forget that there are people. And at the same time, the debate can be very much ISIS-focused. So we're trying to challenge these 2 things. But when it comes to ISIS, I think the key thing to remember is that the drivers for why ISIS came about in the first place, unfortunately, are still there on the ground in Syria. As Lena was saying earlier, the grievances that people held have only intensified with this conflict. They have not disappeared. And ISIS preys on grievances, and with the regime taking this policy of punishing anyone that rose against it, we may not necessarily see ISIS as ISIS re-emerge, but we may see something resembling ISIS re-emerge. And only a week ago, on our platform, syria.chathamhouse.org, which is the microsite for the Syria from Within project, we published a short, but I think very meaningful article about what next for ISIS, in which this issue of grievances was raised. There are people who may not necessarily like the ISIS ideology, but if they feel abandoned, then they're going to be courted. The other thing is, of course, all we've achieved now as the International Anti-ISIS Coalition is take territory back from ISIS, but ISIS itself has not been eradicated. I know that foreign fighters are being, let's put it this way, I don't know the scale, But to a degree, some foreign fighters have been smuggled into Turkey by smugglers that operate in border regions. Others have definitely been sold by smugglers to the SDF, and that's another story, that the SDF is also one of the actors in the war that is not always necessarily acting ethically. The grievances that are resulting in some ways in which the SDF has been dealing with supposed ISIS supporters adds to the problem. The situation of people in camps, people who were with ISIS who have been detained, is very dire. I frankly worry a lot about the children and the women who are just being indirectly punished by being abandoned. This is only going to stoke further grievances. What is needed instead is a process of de-radicalization and social reintegration, but that's a whole other debate. So I think the international community is sadly adding to the problem in the way it is handling the ISIS situation in the northeast. So with the regime continuing, the grievances continuing, the international community acting in this way, the SDF being rather transactional itself. And that's not to add the engagement by some of the hybrid actors from Iraq with elements of ISIS, because, hey, they defeated them militarily, so who cares about economic engagement? That's fine. They're all there on the ground. The smuggling networks just have different patrons now. So this has meant that although ISIS has lost a lot of money, it has not lost all its money, and it has transformed into a mafia that is able to sustain itself economically, waiting for the opportunity to relaunch itself militarily, although it would have to do it under other guises, and although I think it'll be difficult for it to gain territory once more, but it can definitely increase its presence as an insurgency, and as we know, it's already become an insurgency. So the ISIS story is far from over.
Thank you. Salma, to that question of transitional justice.
I think you're right in that, of course, the regime is going to subvert and disfigure this notion of transitional justice. And I think it's what we have, talking about what mechanisms will be created and looking whether there's opportunities within them for people to get their rights or whether it's actually is one way. The other way is to continue to pressure the UN, Russia, to provide some mechanisms for real redress. Coming from the Brussels conference and the preparations for it, where justice was not even on the agenda in the beginning. It took a lot of advocacy to even put justice and with social cohesion on the agenda. It took a lot of effort to bring these issues, and one of the main actors that was opposed to it, my understanding is some of the UN agencies that were there. And so I think it's going to be a challenge to get, and this is a conference about the future of Syria, where justice was not on the agenda. And so it's, the regime is going to have its own process for justice, whatever, that is. But even I think we need to continue to lobby the international community, Russia, and the UN, which to actually create some avenues for redress. And that, you would expect that the minimum should be there as allies and supposed leaders of human rights, but it's an uphill battle.
Alina, on the Russian
Hayed, I don't think I spoke about Russia as the safeguard of the Syrian community, or the one who is coming to provide, safety, stability, democracy, whatever. We've mentioned in the paper that, Russia has its own problems with democracy and with freedom of expression. But given the current situation, and in comparison to the Iranians who are coming also with a religious agenda, imposing it on the local community that is predominantly Sunni, the locals would prefer to have the Russians on the ground. Definitely not. Also regime or their, Shia militia that they're sending into mainly Sunni areas that revolted against the regime. The Russians also are using this for the appealing the international community, appealing the EU to say we are here, we've prevailed safety and stability. They brought in lots of journalists on their own jets to show them that they're distributing food in Rastan and in other areas. They had concerts in Palmyra to show that things are going back on track. And this is all for their own propaganda, whether locally inside Russia or also internationally to attract funding for rebuilding or whatever or reconstruction. But for the locals, and in comparison, that's why I said they are the lesser evil. If you want the regime to go in or the Iranian to go in or the Russians, they definitely prefer the Russians. And we've seen evidence that, the damage was less when the Russians were there, but it doesn't mean that they are the best option for the Syrians there.
My question was, do you see them doing more without any sort of changes on the political reconstruction process?
Well, they are involved, and you've seen in the paper, and Lina talked about that with the structure of the state. They are involved on a military basis. They are involved on a security basis as well, and they are involved on the economy. Sorry? It's not their priority. It's not their priority, but because they want to build on attracting funds and aids from outside, they want to project the image that they are there to save civilians. They were there in the evacuation of Douma. They were not there in Hajar al-Aswad or others, and the situation was worse. So, but still, at the same time, they were bombing, bombing Idlib. Even in Douma, they were bombing Eastern Ghouta before a deal came to terms, to their terms and the regime's terms.
So I promised you all one more round, but we've pretty much run out of time. And there was one question. If it can be a 15-second question and a 30-second answer, we can get to it.
Okay, you put me on the spot. My name's Philip Luther. I'm from Amnesty International. Accountability. I wanted, Salma's raised it a number of times, and I bring it in just because there's an international mechanism I don't think has come up today. It's the one with it actually takes about 15 seconds even to say it, but it's the International Independent and Impartial Mechanism. But the UN General Assembly created a mechanism that's looking into investigating judicial investigations into war crimes and crimes against humanity. Now, that at the moment is effectively a prosecution arm that has no court to take cases to. In the long term, that's important for justice and accountability, maybe transitional justice mechanisms. The question is, can it be more of a lever, a political lever, in the shorter term? Shouldn't we be talking about that more because some sort of threat of accountability, spoken more about, the absence of the justice element in the room, Brussels, for instance, is very revealing. But could that be talked about more in order to be more of a lever? Thank you.
Thank you for keeping it brief. Anyone want to? Salma.
Sure. I think, yes, and maybe the Triple IM, but also all the efforts that are being done in terms of universal jurisdiction in Germany, Sweden, so on. They're small cases, but I think they're important in keeping justice on the agenda. They're also important as reminders of the narrative, that we don't get past this narrative of the regime, everything under control, they're the best option. They are also important in, if not providing justice in a broader sense, they're also important in continuing to remind of what this regime is, who these actors are, who the victims are, and to continue to keep that on the agenda, whether, until we get something more holistic.
For a conference that's really about inclusive peace building, I think that's the appropriate note to end on. Thank you for asking it. And allow me to turn it to Lina for a last summation.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'm not going to sum up the conference, don't worry. Otherwise, we'd be here for another 8 hours. I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you to everyone who has stayed with us the whole day. Thank you to anyone who showed up even for part of the day. Also to the people remotely, we can wave, who have watched the live stream. Thanks to all the people who have been tweeting. I've been just looking at my Twitter account and the Men Up Twitter reporter account here at Chatham House, and there's a person who I want to thank, who I've never met, called Jean Allegrini. Thank you. You've been amazing. I mean, I'm going to hire you. He's just been tweeting the whole day, like every single thing. But I also want to thank the person we have hired to tweet. Nadine, thank you so much. You've done an amazing job. Thanks to Brahim Kadouni, the unknown soldier. Stand up, sir. I have to introduce this man. He's the man who translates all our outputs on Syria from Within to Arabic, and he's the fastest and most accurate translator I've ever worked with. Thank you. And he's been taking notes all day. I want to say thank you, Ruth, thank you to the panelists, and thank you to my colleagues. Again, Rennie and Nicole in the back, and Georgia, welcome to the team, only her second day, and hey, baptism by fire. I want to particularly thank my colleagues who are the core team of Syria from Within, who I named earlier, Ala, Zaki, Hayed, and Lina, and particularly Zaki, whose crazy idea it is to have this conference in this way. Thank you so much. And now we can all go upstairs for a drink and mingle. And absolutely.